Well, Easter is all about the gospel message. You know what the word gospel means, right? Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the word gospel, and it simply means good news. It's good news, and the good news is that Jesus is alive. That's what we're here to celebrate. That's why we're here to sing, is because there's good news, and the good news is that Jesus is alive. This whole month, we've been talking about the gospel of Jesus and the good news of Jesus. And his whole ministry starts out by him saying, I am here. The Spirit has anointed me and chosen me to proclaim good news. And he proclaims good news to the poor. He proclaims good news to the captives. He proclaims good news to even the dead. And in his ministry, we see that become good news to those groups of people. That the captives are set free, that there's times where he even raises the dead. There's times where he heals the sick. And by the time we get to Easter week, Jesus has done a lot of good stuff in the world. But then we get to Easter week, and it looks like the good news has stopped, and now it's just a week of bad news. Like over and over and over again throughout Good Week, from the moment Jesus marches in on Palm Sunday, it just seems like bad news after bad news after bad thing keeps happening until we get to Friday. And then the culmination of all the bad news happens. And so before we look at the Easter story, which I'm gonna do, we're gonna do that, but I wanna take a moment and just take us back to Friday. Because Friday is actually where the good news begins. Friday is the day that Jesus is crucified. So if you have your Bible, open up to Matthew chapter 27, starting with verse 35. I wanna read the story of Jesus's final breaths. And then what I wanna do is I wanna take a look at the emotional roller coaster that Jesus' loved ones go through watching him die. It starts in verse 35 when it says this. After they had nailed him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. Then they sat around and kept guard as he hung there. A sign was fastened above Jesus' head, announcing the charge against him. It read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. The people passing by shouted abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. "Look at you now!" They yelled at him. "You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Well then, if you are the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross." The leading priests, the teachers of religious law, and the elders also mocked Jesus. "He saved others," they scoffed, "but he can't save himself. So he's the King of Israel, is he? Let him come down from the cross right now, and then we will believe in him. He trusted God, so let God rescue him now, if God actually wants him. For Jesus had said, I am the Son of God." Even the revolutionaries who were crucified with him ridiculed him in the same way. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. One of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, holding it up to him on a reed stick so he could drink. But the rest said, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah comes to save him." Verse 50. Then Jesus, nailed to a cross, shouted out again, and he released his spirit. Now, if your Bible is anything like mine, the next words in the story are not the end. There's more to come to the story, isn't there? Like, we're here because we know there's more to the story. It's not he gives up his spirit and that's the end of the story, but let's not forget what his disciples are going through. Jesus had men and women disciples who followed him everywhere. They heard him preaching good news. They saw him healing people. They saw him raise people from the dead. And their assumption has to be that he has power, he's going to rescue himself. Now, we have the religious leaders and the Pharisees and the elders of the council. They are mocking Jesus by saying, you know what, if you are the Son of God, rescue yourself, then we'll believe in you. Can I tell you this? The disciples were probably praying that prayer too, but they were praying it earnestly. Jesus, rescue yourself. Don't let this happen. You've come to preach this good news. How is this happening to you? And I'll tell you this, when Jesus died, it wasn't Jesus only that died on the cross that day. It was also the disciples' dreams that died on the cross as well. The disciples, they had dreams for Jesus. Their expectation was that Jesus was going to be a political ruler, that he was gonna be the king of Israel, sit on a throne, rule over the nation, and then one day rule over the entire world. And they would be his council. They would be his cabinet. They would be sitting on thrones right next to him. So when they see Jesus crucified by Rome, their dreams die with Jesus. They were dreaming of going from these unknown fishermen to global influencers. That's the dream they had for themselves. We're gonna be powerful, we're gonna influence the world, and all of a sudden, Jesus is crucified, and their dreams come crashing down on that Good Friday. And I wonder if they might have felt a little bit of the weight of responsibility of that. Because if you read the story of Easter week, the disciples actually, they played a role in all of this. They had a responsibility for Jesus' crucifixion. The first part of their Easter story, they had to been thinking these two words: if only. If only. That's how their Easter weekend begins. If only Jesus would have flexed his power, he wouldn't have died. If only Jesus would have called down angels, he could have been rescued. But I think their if only probably went deeper and more to a personal level of, if only I would have done something, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Peter was thinking as he looked at Jesus die on the cross, if only I didn't deny him 3 times. If only I would have kept my word, I could have rescued him from this. I could have saved him from death. Or maybe Judas, if only I didn't betray him for a few pieces of silver. Or maybe Peter and James and John thinking, if only we would have stayed awake when he was praying in the garden, we would have heard the soldiers coming and we could have got out of there ahead of time. Or the rest of the disciples, if only we wouldn't have run away, maybe it wouldn't have led to this. Have you ever played the if only game? Anybody ever play that game? It's typically a game that you play at 3 a.m. This is the game where you wake up at 3 a.m. or you're still awake at 3 a.m. and you're just processing the day that just unfolded or the season of life that has just unfolded. And typically at 3 a.m. you're just thinking, if only I would have done things differently, things would be better in my life. Have you ever played this game? It's a merry-go-round of a game. It's an unending game because you're always replaying what happened in the past. If only I wouldn't have said those unkind words in that meeting, I wouldn't be in the situation that I was in. I should have just kept my mouth shut. Or if only I wouldn't have made that spur-of-the-moment financial decision, my family wouldn't be swimming in the debt that we're swimming in right now. Or if only I would have raised my son a little bit better, spent more time with him, maybe he wouldn't have left home. We play this shoulda, coulda, woulda game all night long, and for some of us, we don't just do it with our lives, we do it with other people's lives as well, don't we? That's when it gets like real fun. It's like, I should have done something. We've got people in our lives who we think, you know what? I could have been their savior. I could have stepped into their life and rescued them. I should have called them. They wouldn't have made that decision. If I only would have known, things would be better than what they are now. The problem with the if only game is that it's a losing game. Nobody's ever won the if only game. It's a game that everybody loses. And the reason you lose it is because the moment you begin playing, the game is already over. It's done. It's a game that looks at the past and evaluates the past and keeps trying to replay the past, but you can never replay the past. And so the if only game, it's a losing game. Now, I believe that we should look to the past because you can learn a lot from the past, but you were never meant to live in the past. And for some of us, that's where we're living. We're living in the past. If only I coulda, I shoulda, I woulda. What we need to do is learn our lesson from the past and then let it go and move on from the past. And how you move on from if only is you trade if only for now what? Now what? Now what is interesting because if only looks towards the past, but now what looks to right now. It looks to what's possible today. What do I do today? A lot of the counseling conversations that I have typically come from somebody stepping into the now what part of their story, where they've had this thing that's happened to them in the past. They've had this mistake even that they've made in the past, and they're replaying it. Eventually we get to the point where we just recognize, I can't do anything about it, so now what do I do? And typically that's when we get the courage to reach out to someone else. Because now we know we have to make a decision about what to do in the future. And it's a lot of my decisions from the past that got me into the now what moment. And so that's when we reach out to figure out what do we do in the future. But now what's scary because it does require us to make a choice of how we're gonna move forward. Moving forward's tough. We wanna hold on to the past. We wanna hold on to the tragedy. We don't wanna let it go. But now what is the thing that leads us to hope? It's a hard question to ask, but it's such a healthy question to ask. I think some of you, like the disciples, you've watched some of your dreams die. You've had things that have happened in your past where you replay them over and over in your mind. Perhaps life hasn't gone the way that you hoped it would go. Perhaps this year has been a letdown so far. And you've recognized that you can't change the past, and so now you're asking, now what? Now what is, it's a fork in the road moment of every story. Because there's multiple paths that you can choose. Unfortunately, the path that many people choose is this path. They move from now what to the end. The end, that's the end of my story. Bad thing happened, now what? I guess my story is over. The disciples, that's where they move on Easter weekend. They watch Jesus crucified, and we're gonna read here in a moment that their next part of their story is they go into hiding. They're scared to death that the people who killed Jesus are gonna come after them next. And so they hide in this upper room, they lock the doors, and they believe that the end is near. And they go into this the end mentality, and the end is it's a worst case scenario mentality. It's the mentality that says, nothing good can come next. There's no chance for anything positive to happen. Let's just end the story right here. I don't even want to try because nothing good, nothing positive can come next. Do you know a person, any kind of people who they're like negative and there's nothing good that can ever come next? Anybody know somebody like that? My son, love him to death. But he is an emotional roller coaster, especially when it comes to sports. My son is now 9 years old, which means that he's beginning to understand sports and he's understanding the rules and the scoring, which is a blast watching sports with him because when things are going great, he is fired up. He's the kid who jumps off the couch and he's like throwing fists in the air when his team's winning and dancing around, ripping his shirt off when you win the game. But we've been watching March Madness, and man, March Madness is maddening sometimes, which is really great for me, not so great for my son because he rides the emotional roller coaster of it. A few days ago, we were watching the Baylor-Clemson game, and on our bracket, we had Baylor winning that game. And so we were watching the game, and it was a close game. It looked like Baylor was gonna win, but then the farther along we get in the game, they lose the lead, and it gets to the point in the game where there's 30 seconds left in the game and Baylor's down by 4 points. Now, if you don't know anything about basketball, that's not the position you want to be in, but it's not the end of the world. Many teams have come back from greater deficits. And so I'm watching the game. I'm on the edge of the seat of the couch, just watching it, rooting for Baylor, rooting them on. And I'm like, come on, you got this. And you got to hit the three. You got to call a timeout. You got to take the foul. My son is sitting next to me going, it's over. It's done. We can't win. Game over. And like his emotional roller coaster just hits the ground. And I'm like, no, you see, it's possible. Other teams have done it, and this is all they need to do. Hit this point, foul, hit another point, miss the free throw. And he's like, no, it's over, it's over. I'm like, stop it. Like, just go to the other room if you're gonna bring that attitude. In his mind, the now what led to the end. And that's what negative people tend to do, isn't it? That's how some of us don't just watch sports, it's how some of us live our lives. Something bad happens, it looks like there's trouble coming up in the future, and we write the end as part of our story. Do you know a pessimistic person, a negative person, a critical person, someone who has just lost all hope that anything positive will ever happen? You know how they got there? Something tragic has happened in their life. They can't figure out how to fix it. So they get to the now what moment and they just believe that there's never gonna be a fix to that. And there's never gonna be a fix to anything positive. So why even try? And it's not just those people, often it's us as well. I think all of us have gone through that part of a journey. For some of you, you sit here and you're sitting here in the midst of a ruined relationship. You've had a breakup that's just ruined your heart, and you've swore off relationships. You know what? Forget it. I don't even want that thing anymore because that'll probably end bad as well. The end. Some of you have gone through career lapses where your career didn't quite go the way that you thought it would go, and you're just wondering if, well, maybe now I just need to give up on this degree. Maybe I need to give up on this calling, and just the end. Some of you went in for a job interview and you thought you did great on the interview, and you get the phone call or the email that you didn't get the job, and now you're like, well, I'm just gonna play Fortnite for the rest of my life, and the end. That's how I'm gonna spend my life. We tend to write the end often with our story. Now, when we look to the past, we know that we can't change the past. Many of us think we can predict the future. You can't change the past, nor can you predict the future. And what the Easter story tells us is that we should never close the book before the story's over. No matter how dark things look, never close the book before the story's over. In the moments where you want to write the end at the end of the crucifixion, in the moments where you want to write the end in the midst of the story that you're living, give the pen over to God, because God is not gonna write the end. In fact, God never writes the end on any story. All of his stories live onto eternity. He never writes the end. You know what God writes instead of the end? He writes these 3 words, and then God. That's how God writes stories. Not the end, but and then God. And I'll tell you this, and then God might be the 3 most powerful words in the English language. When and then God shows up, it changes the story completely. It's like the cosmic Uno reverse card, where life is going in one direction, and then all of a sudden, God steps into the scene and pivots the whole story in a whole new direction. No matter what tragedy has occurred, and then God can turn a tragedy into triumph. Anybody want to admit here to being a wrestling fan? All right, don't just raise your hand, give me a Ric Flair woo. Woo, oh, there's a lot of them. Maybe I won't tell this illustration then. The rest of you, here's what you're thinking. Wrestling, that's scripted, that's fake. Why would we watch that? And I'll tell you, that's exactly why people watch wrestling, is because it's scripted and it's fake and it's entertaining. Now, real sports, what happens in real sports is your team could be losing by 30, 40 points by halftime, and you pretty much know at that moment there's no real reason to finish the game and watch the game, right? Now with wrestling, because it's scripted, it doesn't matter how much you are losing or your guy is losing, there's still a chance that you could win the match because it's a scripted thing. So your guy could be beat up for 20 minutes, then some other guy can lay on that guy, and then the refs start 1, 2, and then all of a sudden a big hairy man in pink boots jumps out from underneath the rink and starts beating the other guy with a chair, and you win. That's the entertainment of wrestling. Wrestling is built on that there's a possibility of an and then moment. And there's something about these and then moments that just give you hope that there's a chance for a pivot. I was doing dinner with some friends a few weeks ago, and we were just sharing a little bit of our stories of where we grew up, what we went through as childhood, how we ended up in the professions that we are in. And one of the questions came up was, in your story, what was the pivot moment of your story? Most of us have that moment where life was going one direction and then something happened and there was a pivot to your story and the direction of your life. And people were sharing different things about, a child or a marriage or this career opportunity, or sometimes it's even a tragedy that pivots a story. And I was trying to think of what was the biggest pivot moment in my story. In my mind, it just kept going back to when I was a 13-year-old boy at a church service that I did not want to be at, where an "and then God" moment happened. Where something happened in my heart, and all of a sudden, what I didn't believe before, now my heart grabbed a hold of. And it was the person of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, and I really believe it was an "and then" moment of my life. Before that, life hadn't gone the way that I would have planned it. I grew up in a family that was a military family with an alcoholic father, and our family suffered because of it. It's very dysfunctional, moving from place to place, losing a home at one point in life, a father who eventually took his life, and then just this anger that was just deeply rooted in my heart because of all of life's circumstances that I would take out on my siblings and my mom and my friends, and then God shows up. As a teenager, my mom forced us to go to church, and I hated every second of it until I don't know what happened. I really don't, but something began to click in my heart, and God writes, "and then God" over my life. It was almost like you're saying, I know what you've gone through, but let me pivot your story, and then God. And as we were sharing this with that group of friends, our stories, I just began to realize that every single blessing that I could list off in my life today is a result of the "and then God" moment of my life. Now, there's things that I'm praying God still writes "and then" over on my heart and my life. But I look at the things that I'm grateful for, I would have none of them if it were not for that "and then God" moment. Had I not met God in that moment, I don't have the wife that I have. I don't have the 3 kids that I have. I don't have any of the friendships that I have. I don't have the community that I have. It's only because God steps into the scene and says, "Nikomas, I'm going to pivot your story. Do you trust me to write the next part?" And then God changes everything. Easter, everything was changed. On that Sunday, the story starts with Jesus being crucified, and then Sunday happens. John 20, starting with verse 1, it unfolds like this. It says, "Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, 'They've taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him.' Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb, and they were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped in and looked and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived, and he went inside. He also noticed that the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and he believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home." A few verses later, in verse 19, we get to see what happens when they're going home. It says, "That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders." They find an empty tomb, and their response is, "Now what?" And their "now what" response is, "Well, our life is at stake now." And so they lock themselves behind these empty doors. They're not sure what's next other than the end. But then, in our story here, an "and then God" moment happens. And it happens this way. It says, "Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them." This is how "and then God" begins. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. See how Jesus, he begins to transition the story from fear to peace. Goes on in verse 20, Jesus spoke, and he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side, and they were filled with joy. So they moved from fear to peace to now all of a sudden to joy when they saw the Lord. And again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." Now he redirects their eyes to the future of, let me show you what's happening next. You've got peace, you've got joy. Now let's look to the future at what's possible. And he gives them this commission. Verse 22, it says he doesn't just give them a commission, he gives them a power. It says he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Essentially what Jesus does is he steps onto the scene and he begins to rewrite the story, rewrite the script, and send it towards an amazing God story. Essentially what he does is he says, from this moment on, the past is in the past. What happened, the betrayal, the denying, the falling asleep, the running, that's in the past. Now we're just gonna look back to the past only to forgive what has happened. Not to live in it, but to forgive it. And now, setbacks and failures and even the death that happened on Friday doesn't define our future. It's no longer the end of the story. And can I tell you, that's what I love about the resurrection story, is that the resurrection story erases the end and writes, "And then God." And then what comes next is just miracle upon miracle. Jesus was crucified, and then God brought new life. Now, what does that mean for your story? I'm not exactly sure. But I got a feeling that if you give God the pen and he begins to write, "And then God," maybe it's a new perspective of what happened in the past. Maybe it's a healing over the wounds that happened in the past. Maybe it's joy in the midst of the darkness that exists today. Maybe it's peace in the midst of fear that exists today. Maybe it's grace upon grace upon grace that's next. Don't write the end. Let God write, "And then God." He's a master storyteller, and that's how he writes stories. Like I said, he never writes the end. When you look through the scriptures, it's constantly him showing up to pivot stories. You look at the very beginning of the Bible, and what's the story? In the beginning, there was darkness and emptiness and chaos. But in the beginning, God. God shows up in the midst of darkness, in the midst of the void, in the midst of chaos. And then God speaks, and there is light, and there is life. You go a little bit farther in the scriptures, and you get to Exodus, and we hear the cries of slaves in Egypt, Pharaoh's slaves crying out from their oppression, thinking that it's the end of their story. And then God shows up and says, "Let my people go free." And freedom is what came next. You go a little bit farther and we see King David writing about being surrounded by enemies and not sure how he's gonna escape. And then God shows up. You see 3 Hebrew men being persecuted and thrown into a fiery furnace for their faith and thinking that that was the end. And then God shows up. You get to Good Friday and the entire world thought it was the end for Jesus. And then God shows up. And we find out it's just the beginning. And it's not just the Easter story, it's our stories as well. God desires to write that for your story. Some of you sit here and you sit here maybe out of guilt, maybe out of shame of the things that you've just gone through in life. Maybe you've had a sin that was just uncovered by a loved one or by an employer. and you think it's the end of the story. And then God can show up and pivot everything. Maybe your family's falling apart, your marriage is falling apart. And then God, it's possible, maybe you got an unforeseen diagnosis, or maybe you've had an unforeseen death in the family. And then God, I don't know what comes next after and then God, but here's what I would tell you. Give God the pen and let him write the next part of the story. And let's see what happens next. He writes the most amazing stories where we want to put the end. He's not done yet. Next week, we're gonna do a special weekend that we call Baptism Weekend, and I'd love to invite you to Baptism Weekend. It's a weekend where people get to write an and then God part of their story. Next weekend, we're gonna see a ton of people step into the baptistry. And when they step in there, every one of us who have ever been baptized, we step in there with our if-onlys. We step in there because there's stuff that's happened in us, to us, around us, and through our own hands and our own dark hearts that we want to be done with, that we're tired of dealing with. And so we step into the baptistry almost like we're putting those things into the grave. We're putting those things into the tomb. And then we're buried down into the water and let the past die. And then God shows up and lifts us out, and we step out to live a new story. Next weekend, we're gonna see that happen for people. And for some of you, you haven't made that decision yet, and this needs to be the time that you make that decision, where you stop focusing on the past, you stop wondering if this is the end, and you give God the pen and let him write the next part of your story. And then God changes everything. Hundreds of people here have experienced that reality. Maybe you need to experience that reality as well.